Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Valentine and I am the manager of the Mixed Migration Centre Asia. And it is with great pleasure that we welcome you here today to our webinar event, The Experience of Refugees and Migrants in Host Countries in Southeast Asia. This webinar brings together two research reports conducted by MMC Asia. The first being a case study on the lives of migrants and refugees in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, including both the opportunities and risks they face in the city. This piece was conducted as part of a global series on refugees and migrants in urban settings for MMC's Global Mixed Migration Review late last year. It was made possible through funding from Dunedin, with Forumai data collection also part funded by Winrock International USAID CTIP. The second piece of research is a report exploring the impact of involuntary immobility and protracted transit on refugees and asylum seekers in Indonesia. MMC has been conducting our Forumai survey with Afghans in Indonesia since 2018, and this report incorporates our Forumai survey as well as additional quantitative and qualitative data gathered specifically for the report. This report was made possible through funding from Dunedin. We have a great lineup of speakers today, including presentations from our researchers, as well as a series of discussants from both Malaysia and Indonesia. There'll be time for questions and answers as well after the presentations, so we look forward to your input. The webinar is being recorded and we will share the link with you as well after the event for you to distribute. The chat box is for technical issues, and if you want to ask any questions, please do so to the panelists in the separate Q&A box. We will answer all questions posted by attendees in the allotted Q&A time at the end, but feel free to drop questions as we go. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Bram Frowles for him to give his opening remarks and then continue with the moderation of the webinar. Bram Frowles is the head of the Mixed Migration Centre and joins us today from Geneva. Over to you, Bram.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Mixed Migration Centre, I would also like to welcome everyone at this presentation of two new research reports, as Jennifer mentioned, developed by our MMC Asia regional hub on the situation of refugees and migrants in Malaysia and Indonesia, respectively. I'm particularly happy to be briefly speaking at an event by our Asia hub today, which has grown a lot in recent years, along with the growth of the MMC global network as a whole. We started this work several years ago with only one regional hub out of Nairobi in East Africa. But even back then, when I was working there before I moved to Geneva, we were always very keen on expanding to Asia. Meanwhile, the Mixed Migration Centre has grown to a global network with 6 regional hubs, 35 full-time staff, and a network of more than 100 monitors continuously interviewing refugees and migrants in more than 20 countries through our Forumai data collection program. And we will hear one of our monitors also speaking today. Collectively, we are working on our 3 overall objectives: to increase the understanding of mixed migration, to contribute to evidence-based migration policies, more rational and nuanced debates around mixed migration, to inform evidence-based responses on the ground, including those by the organization we are a part of, which is the Danish Refugee Council. MMC Asia plays a key role in this growth with an excellent team and an increasing presence in and coverage of several countries in Asia, including, of course, the 2 countries of today's focus, Malaysia and Indonesia. What makes Asia so interesting and important is also that some of the key topics we focus on as part of our global strategy are so relevant in many countries in Asia. Protection, climate change and migration, return migration, involuntary immobility and urban migration, just to name a few of those topics. And to zoom in on those last 2, these are particularly relevant for the focus of today's event. Starting with involuntary immobility. Naturally, in migration research and in policy discussions, there's a lot of focus on mobility, on people moving. But a focus on people who are not moving will also teach us a lot about migration. And especially a focus on those who would like to move, but who are stuck, who are stranded, and sometimes in a situation of extended transit or limbo. And this involuntary immobility is, of course, a particularly important topic in the context of Indonesia, as we will hear a bit later today. And as said, refugees and migrants who get stuck, who cannot move, for example, if certain routes are shut down, are a group we increasingly focus on as MMC in other regions as well, often a forgotten group in migration research. And then there's urban migration. As most of you have hopefully seen, urban migration, as Jennifer also just mentioned, or mixed migration and cities, was the overarching focus of the last edition in 2020 of our annual global flagship report on mixed migration, the Mixed Migration Review. And this report is an annual compilation of essays, interviews, overviews of migration and policy trends, personal stories of refugees and migrants, urban spotlights, which was a particular feature last year, and of course data from our my data collection program. So why did we focus on urban migration? As one of our interviewees said in the report, Marvin Rees, the mayor of Bristol, most migrants leave cities, travel through cities, turn up in cities, and return to cities. So this is the urban reality of mixed migration, the reality of human mobility, you could say. The majority of refugees, IDPs, internal migrants, and international migrants live in cities. So if we talk about migration in general, we have to include cities in that conversation. Migration policies cannot ignore urbanization, but it's also the other way around. Urban policies cannot ignore migration. And this focus on urban migration was part of a broader strategic focus by MMC on cities. And of course, if you're interested in this topic, you'll find a lot more in last year's Mixed Migration Review. So in the context of our global focus on cities, our various regional teams conducted a series of urban case studies in parallel to the development of the global report. And in Asia, we focused this case study on Kuala Lumpur, and we're going to hear more about this study in just a little bit. So again, I would like to thank you all for joining us, and please do enjoy and join us in the discussion today. So with that, I'm going to hand over to the first speaker of today. I will introduce all the speakers separately just before it's their turn to present. And just to remind you again, as Jennifer said, please do write your questions in the Q&A box. So let's go to the first presentation. First presentation of today is by Han on mixed migration in urban settings, the case of Kuala Lumpur. Han is the researcher of the Mixed Migration Center Asia region. Her work within MMC is focused on onwards movements of Rohingya throughout the region, as well as general mixed migration trends across Asia. Han, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Bram, for your kind introduction. Let me share my screen so that you can see my presentation. Is it working? Yeah. Okay. So hello, everyone, and yeah, thank you. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar of 2021. So my name is Han. I'm the researcher of Mixed Migration Center Asia region, and today I'm going to present a case study on the experience of refugees and migrants in Kuala Lumpur. And as Bram and Jen already mentioned, so this case study is a part of our ongoing research in Malaysia, where we mainly focus on Rohingya and Bangladeshi's populations. And this case study at the same time is also a part of MMC's urban case study series, where we look into the mixed migration patterns in cities all over the world, in locations such as Bamako, Bogota, Nairobi, Kuala Lumpur, and so on. So for this research, we look not only into the protection risks and vulnerabilities facing refugees and migrants in Kuala Lumpur, but at the same time, we want to represent their aspirations and contributions, how they see themselves as a part of the city, and what opportunities are available for them. So we want to provide a full picture, both good and bad sides, both bright and dark side of living in Kuala Lumpur. In order to do that, we employ a mixed method approach, utilizing quantitative data from the COVID migrant survey with 101 respondents. And at the same time, we also conducted 10 in-depth interviews with Rohingya and Bangladeshi respondents, together with civil society actors. And then the data was then combined with academic research, government documents, as well as reports from NGOs and international organizations. So a little bit about FORMI for those of you who are not familiar with our data collection initiative. So FORMI is a mixed migration monitoring mechanism initiative. So it is a unique and standardized system of collecting primary quantitative data on mixed migration by the Mixed Migration Center. The individual interviews are conducted by our community-based monitors or data collectors based in different parts of the world. And in Asia, we have been collecting data in Malaysia, India, Indonesia, and Afghanistan. So a standard survey usually covers the profile, the motivation, aspirations of refugees and migrants, their experience during the journey, their assistance, as well as protection risk. However, last year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we adapted our survey and to shift the focus on the experience of refugees and migrants in host countries. And that was also the data that we used for this case study. And starting from this year, we returned to our standard survey. And for those of you who are interested in our new data and publications for this year, we actually having two upcoming snapshots, FORMI snapshots, one on economic integration of Afghan returnees, and the second one on dangerous locations and protection risk in route facing Rohingya en route to Malaysia. So as mentioned, the FORMI data in this case study was collected last year between the period of May and August through phone interview with 101 respondents. And as you can see in the charts, 78 Rohingya respondents in our survey have quite balance in gender distribution. In contrast to Bangladeshi respondents, 23 of them are mainly men. And it's also important to note that in this case study, we define Kuala Lumpur as Greater Kuala Lumpur, which consists of the city center and its surrounding urban areas. So a little bit of background information about mixed migration to Malaysia and to Kuala Lumpur. Malaysia, as many of you already know, has a very long history of migration to the country. And currently the country is hosting nearly 180,000 refugees registered with UNHCR. And at the same time, there are between 2 to 3 million documented migrants and anywhere between 1.6 to 4.6 undocumented migrants in Malaysia. And Greater Kuala Lumpur has the highest concentration of refugees and migrants in Malaysia. Migrants in Kuala Lumpur mainly come from neighboring countries with high unemployment rate like Indonesia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, and India. And meanwhile, the city center alone also hosts nearly 28,000 UNHCR registered refugees and people seeking asylum. Most of them are Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. Despite having a very large number of refugees in the country, Malaysia is not signatory to 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 Protocol. And the government of Malaysia itself have very limited legal protection for refugees and people seeking asylum in the country. By contrast, refugees and undocumented migrants are actually criminalized under national law, and the issue of migration is considered as border management and national security issues. At the same time, the government also offers very limited implementation of targeted integration and social cohesion policies and programs to ensure the long-term settlement of refugees and migrants in the country. So, regarding the mixed migration dynamics in Kuala Lumpur, as you can see in the map, the highlighted areas are the areas with the highest concentrations of refugees and migrants in Greater Kuala Lumpur. And refugees and migrants in the city are very diverse, not only in terms of their countries of origin, but also in terms of demographic characteristics and drivers of migration. So people come to KL to flee the persecution, conflict, violence, poverty, to reunite with their family and to seek for better work opportunities. And most of the time it's a combination of different reasons. And as we talk to refugees, migrants, and civil society actors in the city, we identify that people tend to stay in Kuala Lumpur for medium to long term, thanks to the abundance of job opportunities and other opportunities to access to services in the city. And with a specific regard to refugees, the medium to long-term stay is mainly due to the lengthy resettlement program, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the protracted conflicts, as in the case of Rohingya refugees, they cannot return to their home country. So the next part of this presentation will look at Kuala Lumpur as a city of opportunities for refugees and migrants. So first, KL has been a very attractive destination for people coming from different parts and countries in the region, thanks to its relative safety and stability, as the city is not affected by armed conflict, civil war, or natural disasters. At the same time, the fast-growing economy of Kuala Lumpur means that there are abundance of job opportunities for those in search of better livelihoods. And it is important to note that the economic relationship between refugees, migrants, and the city is not only one way, but it's rather mutual, in the sense that refugees and migrants are also an essential part of KL economy. And when we talk to refugees and migrants working in KL, many of them express that they feel like they are contributing positively to the city's development through their work. KL also provides relatively better access to healthcare and education than other locations in Malaysia, and then the countries of origin of most of refugees and migrants. And even though within the survey respondents, Bangladeshi respondents have slightly better access to healthcare than Rohingya respondents, in total, on average, there are 62% of the total respondents said that they were able to access to health services in KL when they need them. And at the same time, with a specific regard to refugees, the presence of UNHCR office in the city and an active civil society actor also benefit refugees in KL. And for instance, when we survey Rohingya respondents in the city, 2/3 of them said that they have received some kind of support from NGOs, CSOs, or UN since the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak. However, Kuala Lumpur is also a city of risk for refugees and migrants, and especially undocumented migrants. As previously mentioned, Malaysia is not signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, and as a result, refugees are seen as irregular or illegal migrants in the country. And for migrants, there are many different pathways to irregularity. So when we interview some migrants from Bangladesh in KL, we found out that most of them actually came to Malaysia with a regular status. It means that they have a passport, they have visa that allow them to work. But after a while, their documentation expire, and their visa agent and their recruitment agent fail to expire their documentation. And especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, many reported that it is very difficult for them to renew the document in the country. And that's why many of them became undocumented. And a lack of legal documentation can lead to multiple protection risks, as well as can play a role as barrier to accessing essential services like healthcare and education in the city. And that's why many of the respondents that we talked to said that access to legal rights and documentation is among the greatest needs since the pandemic began. Refugees and migrants in Kuala Lumpur also struggle to meet their economic needs due to the low salaries for migrant workers in the city and the high cost of living. Nearly a third of Rohingya respondents and more than 2/5 of Bangladeshi respondents that we interviewed actually reported having lost income as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. And the economic struggles are even more significant among female respondents. So half of the women that we interviewed were not working or earned any income prior to the pandemic, and the rest of them lost their income since the pandemic. And for those who continue working, exploitation and abuse of migrant and refugee workers are very significant and somehow normalized in Malaysia. We documented cases of overwhelming working hours, no employment contract, salary deduction, and even the cases of trafficking. And the situation only gets worse with the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. So as you can see in the graph, the main impact of loss of income had on refugees and migrants that we survey are the inability to afford basic goods like shelter, water, and food, loss of housing, and increased worry and anxiety. With a specific regard to loss of housing, we observed that since July last year, there have been an increased number of people reporting homelessness, mainly due to the increased government's action against landlords who rent their property to people without documentation, including refugees. And as already mentioned, there have been increased risk of labor exploitation since the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And as you can see on the left chart, 100% of the Bangladeshi we interviewed agree that there is an increase in the risk of labor exploitation, while the percentage is much lower compared to Rohingya respondents. At the same time, both groups also agree that there's an increased risk of domestic violence since the COVID-19 pandemic began. And also since the pandemic, there has been also increase in xenophobia and discrimination with a specific target to Rohingya refugees. As many of you already aware, last year there was even a petition asking Rohingya refugees to return to Myanmar, even though we all know that that option is just not possible. And this is mainly due to the Malaysian government rhetoric and public discourse that link refugees and migrants with COVID-19 transmission. And so nearly half of the Rohingya respondents that we interviewed actually said that they have increased experience in racism and xenophobia as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. However, the crackdowns targeting refugees and undocumented migrants amid the COVID-19 pandemic did not only stop at racism and xenophobia. Many respondents that we interviewed also said that there's an increased risk of deportation as well as arbitrary arrest and detention since the pandemic began. So we drafted these recommendations last year in October, and we found out that many of them are still, actually most of them are still very relevant to the today's context of Kuala Lumpur and Malaysia. So we would like to advocate for a political judicial framework to include refugees and migrants in all the programs in Malaysia, regardless of their legal status. We also want to advocate for humane response to border management and prioritize alternatives to detention in the country. Provide targeted social cohesion programs for refugees and migrants so that they can settle in the country for medium to long term. Combat rising xenophobia, discrimination, exploitation against refugees and migrants, especially in the context of the pandemic. Encourage women, refugees, and migrants to gain access to the labor market in KL, and also seize all the arbitrary arrest, detention, and deportation of refugees and undocumented migrants. So how to stay in touch with us? You can access the full report both in English and in Bahasa Malaysian on our website mixedmigration.org, and you can also join our mailing list so that you can stay updated with our further future publications. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks so much for listening, and you are very welcome to ask me any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Han, for this really interesting presentation on the situation of refugees and migrants in Kuala Lumpur. Very interesting also having the balanced perspective you're presenting, showing that Kuala Lumpur, of course, is both a city of opportunities for people, but also a city of risks. Just a reminder to everyone, please do post your questions in the Q&A. So with that, let's move on to the second presentation, presenting our second research report we're launching on involuntary immobility, the case of Indonesia, which will be presented by Barini Lau. She is a freelance researcher focusing on conflict, human rights, and migration in Southeast Asia. She previously lived in Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar, and has worked for the International Crisis Group, Doctors Without Borders, and the Asia Foundation, among other organizations. And she conducted the study for us on Indonesia. Parni, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Bram. I'm going to share my screen. Great. So as Bram mentioned, I led the research team that conducted this research towards the end and beginning of this year. And I'd just like to recognize some of them who are present here in the audience today. I'd also just like to mention that, I'm presenting the research, but I think it's really based on the experiences, many of which are very difficult, that refugees and asylum seekers are experiencing. So hopefully the presentation today does some justice to what they shared with us. And I think we'll also be hearing from other refugees as part of the panel discussion today. So just to get started, this is a quote from a male Rohingya refugee that we interviewed, and I think it really sets the tone in terms of what we were trying to understand through the research, which is the impact of involuntary immobility on refugees and asylum seekers. So I'll just read the quote to you. I say to Indonesians, if there is work, ask me. I need to eat. Before they would refuse because I don't have permission to work. I say to them, I only get 500,000 rupiah, which is about $35 US from the UN each month, and it's not enough for 3 people to eat. I don't always get work 3 or 4 times a week. As long as they'll give me 50,000 rupiah, which is about $350 US a day, I'll take the work. So to just quickly go over the methodology that we used for this study, it's similar to the approach that Han described from Kuala Lumpur, where we again relied on the very rich data from the 4MI surveys, so ones that were conducted before COVID-19 as well as during the pandemic, where the survey questions had been adapted to understand experiences that were specific to COVID. We also conducted an online survey to capture some data points that weren't in the 4MI survey that were more specific to Indonesia. So in total, there were around 2,000 responses that made up the quantitative portion of the data. We also did qualitative research involving 14 in-depth interviews with refugees or asylum seekers. These were mainly majority men, but also 6 women from 7 different countries. And we did other key informant interviews with a range of stakeholders. So in total, we did more than 50 interviews, in addition to consulting secondary sources, such as academic research, gray literature, etc. And again, kind of similar notes with regards to limitations and ethics of the research. So the sampling process is not randomized for any of the quantitative data. So the findings are not representative, so we need to be a bit careful in terms of how we interpret them. And then just in terms of how we conducted the interviews from a research ethics standpoint, we secured informed consent from everyone who was participating in the quantitative and qualitative data collection, and gave them anonymity for the study. Okay, so I'm going to quickly talk through kind of some initially some basic statistics about the population of refugees and asylum seekers in Indonesia before we discuss in a bit more detail the living conditions and the policies that are affecting their experience of being in transit in Indonesia. So in total, there's a population of some 13,000 refugees and asylum seekers from more than 40 countries in Indonesia. I think it's probably useful for us to note that this is a relatively small number in absolute terms with regard to the size of population, the size of refugee populations that some other countries in the region host, and also relative to Indonesia's total population. But the experience of refugees and asylum seekers in Indonesia really illuminates one of the points Bram was making in his introductory remarks, which is that this experience of being trapped in limbo with really no certainty or any sense of control over the future is extremely difficult for this population. And it really illuminates problems that refugees and asylum seekers in similar conditions elsewhere in the world would be experiencing. So in terms of the nationalities, more than half are from Afghanistan, and there are smaller populations from a range of other countries, the larger ones being Somalia, Iraq, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Sudan, and Yemen. Of the population, more than half are men. 1/4 or so are children, many of whom were actually born in Indonesia, and less than 1/4 are women. And almost half of all adults are married, although not all are in Indonesia with their spouses. So in terms of where refugees and asylum seekers live in Indonesia, you can see them on this map. So more than half the population is concentrated in the capital Jakarta and the surrounding area in the province of West Java. And then you can see that there's other populations spread across the country. In terms of our research for this report, the qualitative research was conducted in Jakarta, West Java, Medan, and Makassar, which you can see here on the map. Okay, so then in terms of why do we have this population? Why are refugees and asylum seekers stuck in Indonesia? Well, a lot of this has to do with Australian policy. As many of you may be familiar, since 2013, Australia has invested considerable efforts in restricting irregular movement through irregular maritime routes between Indonesia and Australian waters. And as a result of technical and financial support from Australia, Indonesia stepped up efforts to intercept boats and detained those who were trying to travel onwards by sea. And so this is really what has spurred the shift in Indonesia from being a country that mixed migrants were moving through to a country where people are stuck involuntarily and unable to reach their final destination. And this is also what's caused the significant decrease in new arrivals, although we do still see some refugees and asylum seekers making their way to Indonesia. But especially within the last year, most of those new arrivals have been Rohingya trying to reach Malaysia, where many have family. And as we just heard from Han about the situation there in Kuala Lumpur. So just looking quickly at some of the data, this is UNHCR data showing nationalities of refugees and asylum seekers by their nationality and by their country of origin and the year of arrival. So as you can see, there's been a significant decline since 2014, and that the darker turquoise color is showing you the Afghan population, which remains considerable, but we start to see a shift in terms of the proportion of the new arrivals who are from Afghanistan over time. Okay. In terms of what refugees and asylum seekers in Indonesia want, I mean, they want to be resettled to a third country. This is quite clear from the interviews as well as from the quantitative data that we gathered. However, departures for resettlement from Indonesia fell to their lowest level since 2012, last year. So although the odds are quite poor, this is basically what refugees and asylum seekers are hoping for. In terms of what they're looking for at their final destination, it's very clear from the 4MI data that this is security. To give you an indication of this, 73% of Afghans who were surveyed by 4MI cited freedom from oppression or threats as the reason that they fled. And in terms of the countries of destination, of desired destination, this is primarily Australia, as well as Canada. And here you can see these are resettlement statistics, again from UNHCR, showing how these have changed over time. You'll see there's a significant decrease in the number who have been resettled to Australia. We've seen a steady decrease from 2013 and then a very significant drop from 2018 onwards. One factor within this has been that Australia no longer resettles refugees who registered with UNHCR after July 2014. And because previously, of course, we see that many refugees were going to Australia. This has significantly affected prospects for resettlement. The other factor, of course, has been the significant reduction in the US refugee resettlement quota under President Donald Trump, which you can see the impact of that also here in the graph. Okay, so in terms of the policy response in Indonesia, as Han was mentioning, with Malaysia as well, Southeast Asia is a region that has a weak regional framework as well as weak national mechanisms to manage mixed migration. Indonesia, like Malaysia, is not a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention or the 1967 Protocol, but it is more progressive, does recognize the right to asylum. We also had in 2016 a presidential decree that clarified the status of refugees in Indonesia, but this doesn't allow for integration, and it also did not really expand the rights of refugees and asylum seekers while they are in transit in Indonesia. I think another point here that's important to note is that Indonesia has also moved away from immigration detention. This is not officially a part of the 2016 presidential decree, but this shift has happened over time with support from UNHCR and IOM. And basically since late 2018, refugees and asylum seekers who were previously in immigration detention are now in IOM community shelters. A lot of the support for Indonesia's management of refugees and asylum seekers through the immigration system has come from Australia through a regional cooperation arrangement which supports IOM, which we'll discuss more about in a minute. But overall, I think the main point here is that for Indonesia, the assumption guiding the policy response is that refugees and asylum seekers are a temporary population that will eventually leave. And that perception really shapes what Indonesia is willing to do, and particularly its expectations with regards to burden sharing with other wealthier countries. And you really see that in this comment from an Indonesian government official. We aren't a rich country, but we help based on humanity. Okay, so in terms of the support for refugees and asylum seekers, there are more than half the population, so roughly 7,700 are under IOM care. This population generally has been in Indonesia a long time. More than 70% have been in Indonesia for more than 5 years. The support package that IOM provides with funding from Australia is comprehensive, so it includes this housing in community shelters, most of which are outside Jakarta. That's also a key point. Most of this population is being housed in secondary cities around Indonesia, so places like Medan and Makassar, for example. And the support also provides assistance with healthcare, a living stipend, etc. However, only refugees and asylum seekers who were already in Indonesia before March 2018 are eligible for the support. And historically, actually, many refugees and asylum seekers were self-reporting to immigration detention in order to access IOM care, which is a strange feature of the way that the financial support it has affected the choices of refugees and asylum seekers in Indonesia. So the remaining population, which is around 6,000, live independently within local communities. Most of them are in Jakarta and West Java. Only the most vulnerable are receiving support from UNHCR and the Jesuit Refugee Service, JRS. It's important to note here also that UNHCR did significantly expand support during the pandemic to all independent refugees, and they're trying to continue that throughout 2021, subject to funding. Of course, another key point here, which many people in attending will be familiar with, is that Jakarta and West Java are home to a wide array of refugee-run organizations that provide really key support to refugees, in particular schools. But one of the other aspects of the support for refugees and asylum seekers in Indonesia is that local governments, technically under the 2016 presidential decree, are meant to be managing refugees in their area, but they don't actually have any budget to do so. So overall, what we have is sort of a patchwork of support. It's certainly not adequate, which is why there continue to be refugees and asylum seekers who end up destitute. So there is access to services in Indonesia, but there are also persistent barriers. One positive note is that access to education has generally improved since 2019, but this varies very widely across Indonesia. It's obviously a large country. Refugees and asylum seekers are living in a range of different places, and this is not consistent how this policy of welcoming refugee children into school is implemented. Another factor here is that not all refugees want to send their children to Indonesian school, as some of them feel it's more important for their children to learn English in preparation for resettlement. And here's a quote from a refugee that we interviewed in Iran, from Iran, interviewed in Medan. "The children aren't in school. My son studies on his own using the internet. My daughter has difficulty studying and I'm not able to teach them." With access to healthcare, it's generally accessible at community clinics and government hospitals. Caveat being, of course, that IOM is providing more support for this. UNHCR does also provide support, but it is generally a bit harder for refugees to access that support. But of course, there are very significant barriers still, such as language, as well as costs. And you see that in some of the data that's been gathered by MMC. So here, this is a question about whether children were in school before COVID. And as you see here, 41% weren't receiving school even before the pandemic. So there's a significant proportion who are not in formal education. Just to give you a taste of some of the findings with regard to healthcare, this is showing the barriers that refugees and asylum seekers are reporting as to why they're not accessing healthcare. And the biggest one is that they don't have money to pay. That's very, very clear, with language barriers and sort of just lack of knowledge about where to go being other factors as well. Okay. Of course, there's also very significant mental health impacts of the uncertainty and the difficulty that refugees and asylum seekers have living in Indonesia, where they don't have rights, basically, to live life normally and feel very isolated. The prolonged stay in Indonesia is creating a mental health crisis. This is seen in increased referrals to counseling. Of course, it's possible this is also due to awareness of services that more refugees and asylum seekers are accessing them. But we also see from the 4MI data that during COVID-19, 71% of those surveyed reported that they were feeling more worried and stressed during the second half of 2020. Suicides are also rare among refugees, but they are increasing. There were 2 in 2019, 4 in 2020, and 2 within the first 3 months of 2021. And I think just the sense of despair came through very clearly in the interviews that we conducted. So here's an example of the sorts of things that were described to us. This is a female Rohingya refugee who was interviewed in Makassar. "I can only pray to God. Life is difficult. I want to die so that I won't be a burden for my daughter." Perhaps the most important advocacy issue, though, presently for those working to support refugees and asylum seekers in Indonesia is the right to work and access to livelihoods. Because refugees and asylum seekers don't have this right, many are struggling to get by, relying on savings, borrowing from friends, and informal work. And again, the 4MI data really shows very clearly that this is the case, and also shows the impact of the pandemic in terms of making refugees and asylum seekers that much more vulnerable, because it's now harder for them to rely on people who might have been able to help them out before. Some people do work, but because that's illegal, it's also at risk of exploitation. The overarching concern from the Indonesian government side is that extending work rights would potentially encourage refugees to stay, but when we inquired about this in interviews and in the surveys, that doesn't seem to be the case. For most refugees and asylum seekers overwhelmingly still want to be resettled to a third country. There's ongoing efforts, however, by UNHCR and IOM to provide vocational and livelihood programs, often in partnership with or in coordination with the Indonesian government. which is an ongoing effort to try to increase the strengthening of refugees and asylum seekers' skills, with the hopes that there will be more opportunities for livelihoods in Indonesia, but also how developing these skills will also help access longer-term solutions. So that brings me to the last slide, which is that it's clearly urgent that to improve the refugee and asylum seeker lives in Indonesia, simply because they are staying there for the short and medium term. There are not durable solutions. The traditional ones are not immediately available or on the horizon. And so access to services, more opportunities, and coping mechanisms are really essential to combat the kind of isolation and sense of desperation that many people feel. One of the most promising options looking ahead is what UNHCR calls complementary pathways, which would include refugees and asylum seekers moving to other countries through legal, safe migration routes, through labor mobility and educational schemes that would provide opportunities while also ensuring refugees and asylum seekers still have access to protection. So there's obviously a lot more detail, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, and I'd also encourage anyone who's interested to have a look at the full report, which talks about all of these issues in much more detail. So I'll leave it there, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Bharani, for your presentation, really interesting presentation. And indeed, I would encourage the audience to go online to our website and read the full report, which is a really interesting and important read. So now that we've listened to the two presentations on the research studies, we'll move on to our discussants. I will introduce them just before giving them the floor. And each of them will sort of touch upon different issues that play a role in the two studies that we did in Malaysia and Indonesia, or in the broader region. So the first discussant of today is Eric Paulsen. Eric is the representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. He co-founded Lawyers for Liberty in 2011, a human rights organization in Malaysia, and was its advisor until becoming the executive director from 2014 to 2018. Each of our discussants will talk for around 5 minutes. So Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bram, for the very kind introduction, and thank you, Mixed Migration Center, for the invitation. I'll be speaking on the role of ASEAN in addressing the situation of refugees and migrants in the region. Southeast Asia is at the crossroads of the mixed migration movement. There are refugees fleeing from conflict or persecution, seeking asylum in neighboring countries, while many others are migrants leaving their home countries in search of better economic opportunities. There are a wide variety of overlapping push and pull factors that cause people to make irregular movements, often putting themselves through dangerous journeys. While governments have a duty to protect their borders and respond to security concerns, the enforcement of stricter border controls can heighten the vulnerabilities of refugees and migrants who move irregularly. They may take more risks to circumvent immigration authorities, often resorting to smuggling networks, or they may even fall into the hands of human traffickers, as exemplified by the discovery of mass graves on both sides of the Thai-Malaysian borders in 2015. Myanmar is the biggest source of refugees for neighboring ASEAN countries, especially to Thailand and Malaysia. With the decades of civil war, persecution against the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities, and more recently, the military coup. We have seen refugees and migrants make the dangerous journey from Myanmar and Bangladesh to Southeast Asia. The humanitarian consequences are considerable, as people traveling through unsafe land routes and across the seas in search of safe haven or for a better life. Accidents are frequent and many disappear at sea or are simply pushed back. They face hardships both in countries they transit through and once they reach their final destination. It is important that we keep a spotlight on this dangerous migration, as it can save lives. Without a spotlight in 2015, Indonesia and Malaysia would not have agreed to provide humanitarian assistance to the thousands of refugees at sea and offered them temporary shelter. The 2015 crisis also led to the special meeting on irregular migration in the Indian Ocean, organized by the Thai government, which led to important discussions, although what were agreed and acted upon were limited. As for economic migrants, if they are irregular or becomes irregular, they are also in a difficult and dangerous situation, as without legal status, they would be subjected to the host country's immigration laws, which can involve arrests and long periods of detention until eventual deportation. Labor migration is of critical importance in Southeast Asia. There are an estimated 7 million migrants across ASEAN countries. Southeast Asia contains both labor sending and labor receiving states. On the receiving end, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand are estimated to receive over 96% of total intra-regional migrants. Most intra-regional migrants in ASEAN are low-skilled workers. This lower skill and often less educated nature of the migrants make them especially vulnerable to exploitation. Undocumented economic migrants in some ASEAN member states experience serious mistreatment, including high costs paid to people smugglers, fraud by recruitment agencies, non-payment, low or unlawful deduction of wages, long working hours, poor working and safety conditions, unlawful withholding of passports and legal documents, no employment contract, thus making them more vulnerable to exploitation. Worse, they sometimes suffer physical violence, held in illegal detention, suffer from trafficking and slavery-like working conditions, and even sexual abuse for women workers. Generally speaking, ASEAN member states have been slow to adopt UN and ILO instruments that help promote social security protection, in particular instruments that cover migrant workers. Compliance with the standards embedded in these instruments has often been weak. However, ASEAN does recognize the need to protect migrant rights and has pursued various regional measures to combat exploitation, including adopting the landmark 2007 ASEAN Declaration on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrant Workers. However, it was only in 2017, 10 years later after its adoption, that ASEAN finally agreed on the ASEAN Consensus on the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers, a document aimed at giving effect to the commitments in the declaration. The long-standing negotiations stem from the differences between labor sending and receiving countries. While Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand are labor receiving states and emphasize the economic aspect of migration, Indonesia and Philippines are labor sending states and emphasize the rights aspect of migration. The ASEAN Consensus aims to strengthen social protection, access to justice, humane and fair treatment, and access to health services for the region's migrant workers. It stipulates the general principles, fundamental rights of migrant workers and members of their families, specific rights of migrant workers, obligations, and commitment of ASEAN member states. It aims to establish a framework for closer cooperation among member states on addressing migrant workers' issues in the region. While it is non-legally binding as most ASEAN documents, the ASEAN Consensus is considered a living and evolving document, and it is for the respective ASEAN member states to implement measures that address the commitments expressed in the document. The document's negotiation process, however, stands as an example of inclusive participation in discussing regional policies. The ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labor, or AFML, established as a broad-based platform for discussing migrant labor issues under the framework of the ASEAN Senior Labor Officials. It is the first of its kind and should continue as a venue for discussing progress in national level implementation as well as issues and concerns for migrant workers in ASEAN. Some progress has already been made, especially those embedded in the operational activities of the mandated ASEAN institutional frameworks. In particular, the Committee on the Implementation of the Declaration of the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrant Workers, or ACMW, and as found in the Action Plan 2018 to 2025 to implement the ASEAN Consensus. Though not the ideal outcome expected by many, the ASEAN Consensus can provide some imperative persuasion for national implementation of regional commitments and the possibility of more bilateral or sub-regional initiatives under this regional framework. Although ASEAN is keen to promote safe migration, i.e. that migration should be regular, but in reality this may not be possible as refugees flee due to war or persecution, and oftentimes irregular migration is the only option. As for economic migrants, there are circumstances that compel them to choose irregular migration as an option, either through lack of regular migration opportunities or as a cost-benefit analysis that regular migration also does not guarantee legal status or a stable or as promised employment. Meaning, if you are going to get exploited anyway, why pay more? ASEAN's general policy response to irregular migration is mostly from the perspective of security and sought to address it by tackling smuggling of migrants and trafficking in persons and other transnational crimes. However, it is essential that the measures adopted by states to manage migration movements integrate some essential humanitarian consideration and adherence to international laws and norms. For instance, without a proper screening system, how can we be sure that those who are vulnerable or at risk, such as refugees or trafficked people, are protected and not be put in harm's way? What happens next when more boats arrive carrying desperate refugees to the shores of Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia? Or as we are seeing now, Karen refugees fleeing to the Thai borders. The laws and policy concerning refugees in these ASEAN member states most affected are not uniform or consistent, and much also depends on the prevailing national political climate and the situation of COVID-19, which will decide how these refugees or undocumented migrants will be treated. ASEAN should respond more urgently and with coordinated policies both for refugees fleeing persecution or conflict and economic migrants looking for better opportunities. While each member state will rightly have its own laws and policies, common rules should be developed to give refugees and migrants more protection and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, also for zooming out and giving us more of a regional, broader perspective and also a good legal perspective. Before moving to the second discussant of today, we'll have a little bit of an intermezzo. Abdullah Mohammadi, who is MMC's former coordinator, will read a letter written by a refugee living in Malaysia. Unfortunately, he could not be with us today due to the current situation in Malaysia and concerns for his safety. However, he wanted us to share these words with you all today. So, Abdullah, the floor is yours to read this letter.
Thank you, Bram. Hello, everyone. Before I read the letter first, I want to thank you all for joining this event, and then just to remind ourselves the importance of migrants and refugees' voices. So many of them are forced to leave their homes to whatever reason, and many are living in poverty and difficulty, but this doesn't mean that they are voiceless. They need to be heard. They must have a chance to talk, to speak up. And if we listen, we will understand how powerful their voices are. Today, we have a letter, as Bram mentioned, from a Rohingya refugee currently living in Malaysia that I will read for you now. We also have an Afghan refugee from Jakarta with us that will talk and share his experience with us a bit later. So here is the letter. Dear decision makers, humanitarian actors, NGO workers, and other conference participants, I'm a long-term refugee in Malaysia, not by choice. I fled my country to Malaysia for safety, expecting to be resettled or start my life again somewhere else. But after nearly 7 years here, I still heard nothing about my relocation or resettlement. I don't know what is wrong with me that I'm not accepted. But I'm not alone. Many refugees have lived here for a long time. Refugee children were born and trapped in a vicious circle refugee circle. Refugee children can only get primary education from community-led education centers. Even then, many have to give up their education to help their family. Most refugee children in Malaysia are growing up with no education, no knowledge, and no guidance. They are not aware of what is allowed and what is not allowed. Their lives and their future would be very difficult if they have access to free education after primary school. With the COVID-19 and police raid, it is even harder to be a refugee in Malaysia. With a simple crime like driving a motorbike to work with no license, some people got arrested and sentenced to nearly 2 years. People with no documentation also got arrested for no reason. Imagine if a father gets arrested, the whole family will have to become beggars and live in the streets. They have no choice. Despite all the struggles, we are thankful to the Malaysian government for letting us live here with their sympathy. Here we don't have to face constant fear of torture and killings like in Myanmar. But sympathy doesn't grant us the right to work and live a life with dignity. My only dream is to be resettled in a country where my family are considered legal and where my children can go to school like other kids. A refugee from Malaysia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. Please extend our gratitude to this person for sharing the experiences. I think it's a very important reminder, of course, to all of us of the daily reality of refugees in the region or around the world for that matter. So we'll now turn back to our discussants. Next on the list is Lilian Fen, who is the International Director and co-founder of the Kutanyu Foundation, a regional humanitarian organization based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and Aceh in Indonesia. She is also chair of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network's Rohingya Working Group. Lilian, the floor is yours. Please try to keep your contribution within the 5 minutes, because I do see a lot of questions popping up on the chat. So we hope to have as much time left as possible for the Q&A towards the end. Thank you. The floor is yours, Lilian.
Thank you so much, Bram, and thank you for the excellent presentations from Han and Bryony. I'd like to comment a little bit on Malaysia and just to maybe add a few points to complement the presentation that has been given. I think it's really critical for us to look at, it's policies on the one hand, but I think it's also attitudes by government and by the public as a whole. The type of perception that generally the public is encouraged to have because of the ways that we shape policy on migrants and refuse to shape policy on refugees, or continue to have a lack of policy on refugees, is very instrumental in sort of pushing the public view on generally towards refugees and migrants towards a view of these communities as being number one, burdens to our society, and number two, and particularly in the context of the COVID pandemic since last year, increasingly also to be seen as a threat. And this is really worrying, particularly when these populations are amongst the most vulnerable in our societies. So I think we need to look at, I saw that there was a question that was raised about the xenophobia, and I think it is really critical for us to look at, not just what the policies are saying, but also really what the impact of the policies are. And I think looking at the ways in which these groups have been, really marginalized over and over again, and doubly marginalized and doubly penalized, if you like, for the vulnerability and fragility of their status, and in for the most part not of their own choice. And I think it's important to look at these are quite different sets of groups and sets of processes, right, which each group, migrants and refugees, are sort of determined by. And as was shared by Han, the fact that most migrants in Malaysia actually come to this country legally, but there is a very high number of undocumented migrants, which means that there's also a very high number, a high level of incidents which basically create a situation where people become undocumented. And I think that is really critical. The fact that people end up in these exploitative situations, you know, migrants who come here to work with a permit under a certain employer in a permitted sector, end up being exploited, you know, in the course of that, end up having all types of experiences, you know, from documents being withheld, to wages not being paid, and then have very little recourse to that legally. So I think we really need to be pushing also on looking at what are those processes that make people become undocumented in the process of being here when it comes to looking at migrants. And then of course in refugees, the fact that there's still no actual legal framework that makes that distinction between a refugee who comes here to seek protection and an undocumented migrant. And you know, the language that is used in Malaysia to define and to talk about these groups of people, it's actually very unkind language, and it has very derogatory, you know, implications and signification, which we really need to be trying our best to move away from. And there are, I think it's important to look at the role that different actors have. You know, the role of the media is extremely important. The role of religious leaders is extremely important. We've seen over the last year just this enormous amplified rise in xenophobia. And I think we can say that a lot of that xenophobia to begin with was actually quite constructed. It was quite orchestrated and triggered by you know, certain groups who were basically hiring cyber troopers to develop online campaigns. It started off actually really as anti-Rohingya rhetoric, anti-Rohingya campaigns, but it quickly spiraled into something that was much wider than that, and it's still persistent. And I think that we need to be very cognizant of the fact that even when now the government is realizing that it can't, the economy really can't survive and can't recover without migrant workers, and they're starting to put in place, you know, certain types of programs to recalibrate, as they call it, you know, and offer the opportunity for persons who are undocumented, migrants who are undocumented, to become documented to seek an employer in a permitted sector. The damage has already been done, and it's very important, I think, for us to look at how to really try to give protection to these groups in a way that changes the perception and changes the type of recognition of contribution, right? You know, from official channels as well. We need to change the rhetoric into one, certainly for migrant workers, you know, one where we're recognizing the contribution of migrant workers. And when it comes to refugees, looking at the potential contributions that refugees could make as we continue to advocate for the work rights of refugees. I think the other part that I'd like to add is, I saw there was a question also on, you know, why this study focused mainly on Rohingya and Bangladeshis and not other populations. I think it's important for us to look at the fact that there are very diverse populations of both migrants and refugees in Malaysia. And there are differences in different groups accessing services as well. That's also very important because there are certain groups, the Rohingya, for example, the Rohingya are a group which does not have a high level of literacy, and that's of course because of the levels of denial of access to services and access to education that they've gone through all the way from Myanmar to Bangladesh and, you know, everywhere else where they've been before coming to Malaysia, and that has an impact. But at the same time, the Rohingya have, they are the group, I would argue, that actually tends to learn the local language faster than any other group. So I wouldn't say that it leads to integration, but it does lead to the ability to communicate for the men, at least. This is not the case with Rohingya women. Rohingya women tend to still really struggle with the local language, are, you know, very are highly illiterate as well, and are very much homebound also. So there are a lot of, you know, there's a lot of diversity within these communities. But even within the groups who are in Kuala Lumpur, there are other groups even which are much smaller than the Rohingya population. So Afghans, for example, Syrians, Yemenis. there are many of those groups where there's a very high level of vulnerability and a very high level of mental health, concerns. And I think that the entire community here of, NGOs who've been working with both migrants and refugees have been extremely concerned with the rise in mental health conditions and the inability for, non-governmental organizations to cope with providing the types of services that are needed, and the lack of access that these groups tend to have with the government services as well. So I do think that there are a lot of protection issues that do need to be raised, and it's really welcoming to see MMC look into these issues, and we're looking forward to more research from MMC on these topics.
Thank you very much, Lillian, for excellent presentation and really great insights into the situation in Malaysia with a focus on protection. And I'm sure there will be more reports coming up in the future from MMC Asia. So thanks so much. I would now like to give the floor to Jamal Mohammadi, who is one of our 4MI monitors in Indonesia. Jamal has been a refugee in Indonesia for nearly 8 years. And besides supporting us with our data collection in Indonesia, Jamal is attending an international university in Jakarta and teaching English for refugees and asylum seekers in his area. So we're really glad to have you on board with us today, Jamal. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Bram. Hello, everyone. I try to speak as fast as I can. My name is Jamal. I'm originally from Afghanistan, but I grew up in Iran as a refugee. My father was a Shia mullah, and he ran away from Afghanistan to Iran when Taliban took the country and started killing Hazaras and those who were practicing other beliefs than theirs. After he passed away, my family moved to Australia, and I stayed in Iran studying in university. And by the way, I met Abdullah at that time in the university. Refugees in Iran don't have job opportunities. They are only allowed to work in factories or construction. Also, studying is a challenge for them as they have to pay for it. Then I also tried my chance if I could have a life in Afghanistan, but there was nothing and no one there waiting for me. Plus the threats were still there. So eventually I decided to leave Iran and join my family in Australia in 2013. Since then, I have been waiting for resettlement in Indonesia. I did not expect to stay in Indonesia for such a long time. Neither did other refugees nor the Indonesian government. We're all waiting here for a solution from outside. Sometimes it feels like wasting the best days of life here. However, when I look back, I realized there was no opportunity that I missed. To be honest, I'm happy now to be here because at least there's a hope for a better future that I could not find in Iran or Afghanistan. The biggest challenge for refugees here is providing the costs of living. Almost all refugees receive allowance from families or friends outside who are not ready to support refugees for so long. However, here Indonesian people are very kind, and I'm so grateful to meet such people in my life. I have made a lot of friends here, learned a lot from them, and I'm sure I will miss Indonesia when I leave. So in Indonesia, soon after arriving, I started using my time in a positive way by teaching English to other refugees in my room and self-governing learning centers for refugees. I also do Muay Thai here and join some local competitions, but there were more competitions that I couldn't join because they need insurance, and then I'm a refugee. There are other fighters, not only fighters, there are other talents here among refugees like musicians, artists, but there's no support for them as well. But I believe this sport helped me a lot to be able to stay positive. And recently, I'm very grateful to find a way to an international university here. There are very few refugees studying in this university compared to the whole number of refugees interested and able to be university students. Right now, the only option for most refugees is studying English in the learning centers. Even English classes are always full and have long waiting lists. showing how important education is for refugees. Refugees in Indonesia are waiting for years without being ready for it. So there are people who have been far from their families for years. Some people stay positive and do whatever they can, such as giving services in refugee schools and communities and other related NGOs as teachers, translators, and activists, or at least some people study English. Some others cannot hold it and fall into deep depression. We had several suicide cases among refugees. They were young people who gave up on waiting, decided to kill themselves. Sometimes refugees hold demonstrations in front of the UNHCR's office asking for resettlement, but UNHCR says it is the governments that decide about the resettlement and not them. So the situation for me looks like a problem for all sides, refugees, UNHCR, Indonesian government, that is caused by none of them. And in my opinion, everyone is doing their best to find solutions. For example, I heard from Gading that GRS is talking with the Indonesian government about livelihood for refugees. Other NGOs do as much as they can to support those in need. But because of the low budgets and lots of demands, it is hard for them to choose who to help. Roshan Learning Center, it's a nonprofit organization in Jakarta teaching refugees, has a program for refugees to take GED certificate so that they are prepared for university. Also, Indonesian government kindly allows us to stay in Indonesia and be uninvited guests for all these years. And UNHCR does all the official work for us to be resettled as soon as possible. I believe the countries that accept refugees are not neglecting us, maybe from a different point of view, but I'm sure they care about refugees as they are accepting us and sharing their countries with us. And it is understandable if they need time to prepare for it. So at the end of my presentation, I would like to say I'm very grateful to be here today and be the voice of my community. As a refugee, I would like to thank all people and communities who support us. To be honest, for me, it sucks to be a refugee, but at the same time, I'm very grateful to be a refugee because it became the reason for me to meet people who are so kind that think and care about other people's lives, especially refugees who have lost everything. I hope one day we experience a world without any hatred, where all people accept each other and no one has to leave their home. Thanks for living. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jamal, for sharing your very personal story and I think great encouraging words towards the end. And also let me thank you for your work you're doing. It's really because of the work you do as a former monitor for us, along with all the others that work for us on a daily basis, that we are able to produce these kind of research reports as the Mixed Migration Center. Thanks to you, and of course, thanks to all the refugees and migrants who share their stories with you. So we are really grateful for that. Now moving on to the last speaker, last but not least, our fourth discussant, Gading Gumilang Putra, who is the National Information and Advocacy Officer with the Jesuit Refugee Service Indonesia, which is MMC's former implementing partner in Indonesia. Gading is a lawyer by training and has been working on legal aid and advocacy for asylum seekers and refugees in Indonesia in the past 7 years. Gading, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bram. Respecting the time, I'll probably skip the PPT presentation. I'll thank you as well for the opportunity given to us, and thank you for sharing the presentation. Bryony, I think, have touched pretty much the most important issue. My comments will be just complementary and highlighting several parts of it. So Indonesia is part of the region of Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific. This is a region that has a country of origin, but also a country of transit, if that is still okay to call it transit, and a destination for the migrations. As mentioned, it's a non-signatory, so heavily relying on UNHCR for RSC processing. And it actually creates the perspective of the policies framework and the perspective towards refugees management in Indonesia, the UNHCR is sort of responsible to it. So this is something that becoming more and more homework to all of us here in Indonesia. And especially resettlement was assumed available and regular for the majority of asylum seekers as durable solution, as well as the government. But the trend showing that as shown by Brayoni, that the trend has been decreasing with a less of 1% globally, and people are waiting 7-8 years. Jamal has shared about his experience here in Indonesia, that also experienced by others as well. Here in Indonesia, they are recognized, but not really having a legal identification and various basic rights as well as inclusion. So heavily relying on saving, family, friend support from abroad, limited NGOs support, and not regular, as Brayoni mentioned. Some were supported by IOM, started from the generous support from the past through Australia, and now there are living around 5,000 of it who are not supported. And this is something unique that happening in Indonesia, as I think also mentioned, is that it sort of pushes people to self-surrender, sleeping on the sidewalk in front of both UNHCR office as well as detention center, hoping to be detained so that they can access for basic needs. However, Indonesia is also rich. Indonesia as a society has a rich experience for receiving refugees in various contexts, and something that I think could be experienced to elaborate further in finding a solution, which is an emergency situation at sea, something that we keep seeing in Aceh, how the local people, through their values, saving life at sea, although now it's getting more and more decreasing through a lot of pressures from external factors, as well as alternative detention models through community housing, and as well as independent living. And both, they do have some pro and cons, and still vulnerable groups are not really responded yet fully. Seeking asylum is part of the Constitution. In 2016, there has been regulations, number 125, providing the definition and putting special attention on vulnerable groups such as women and children. And this actually leads to a immigration letter stating that the detention center should be used as its original intention, which is not for asylum seekers and refugees. So detention is not a norm, although it can still happening at the moment. It's less than 10% are detained in Indonesia. And as mentioned earlier, formal education is possible, although it's with limitation without the diploma, and also without using the government budget. Access to livelihood and empowerment are recommended, but not yet regulated. So the legal and policy landscape in Indonesia are mainly focusing on resettlement, although it's not really happening as well. In regards to issues on practical level, it's focusing on practical level, they're focusing through the ad hoc basis. Although Indonesia have opportunity because we do ratify several human rights conventions as well, but inclusion is very, very limited. So risk and protection concern have been elaborated earlier by Brayoni as well as Jamal. I will not repeat that. However, one of the highlights is through since the COVID-19, the stigma toward refugee and asylum seekers as carrier, we saw that happening, although not in all places. Refugees and asylum seekers in Indonesia are often not seen as victims of human trafficking or people smuggling. So access to seek asylum, although it is regulated on the or mentioned on the Constitution, are often still not. We can still see some limitation. For example, rejection at sea, detention at the airport, and limited access to UNHCR for registration. So on the last part of my comment would probably potential and existing collaboration or opportunity. The first one would be access to livelihood is would play a key role in Indonesia, and this should be based on the perspective that asylum seekers and refugees are not a burden. I think the term burden sharing should probably replace with opportunity sharing. If they given chance, they can contribute to the development of the society and the host country. And this is what we're seeing more and more. Growing numbers of refugee led organizations shows compassion, that they are part of solution, that they can be innovative, that they do have compassion to help others, and they should be supported in our opinion. Access to complete education and livelihood actually could improve their quality of life, probably decreasing depression and life suicide sort of notes that have already been mentioned, and at last could actually provide an alternative or complementary pathways to the third countries. And also the data-driven policy would be very important. I think this is a good initiative by MMC that can actually support the local government, as they are actually currently the sort of the front man under the presidential regulation. So if it can push more and more innovation, that would be really good. And if it's possible through regional landscape, that could be good if there is a body or mechanism understanding that Malaysia, Indonesia, and possibly Thailand also have similar issues and could maximize the inclusion and reference through SDGs, Global Compact for Migration, as well as Global Compact for Refugees. I think that would be all from me, and happy to answer more or discuss more during the QA session. Many thanks, Bram.
Thank you so much, Gading. Never easy to be the last in a long list of excellent speakers, but great job, really great additional insights and a deep dive into the situation in Indonesia. Thank you very much. We're almost running out of time, so we don't have much time for the Q&A, but I see have been lots of questions from the audience, which is really great. Thanks so much for your participation. And I can see that most have been answered already by the team in the background. So also big thanks to the team for answering all those questions while we were listening to the presentations. We have a little bit of time, maybe to at least take one or two questions verbally in public. And maybe we can hand over to Han to answer the question that is still open by Samuel, who I believe is with UNHCR. Han, I'm sure you have read the questions. I'm not going to read it out to save some time, but could you maybe try and answer Samuel's question, please? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Bram, and thanks, Samuel, for raising the questions. So since we are running out of time, I will be very short. So the question is about the gender aspects of mixed migration and protection risk. And I just want to say that at MMC, we really acknowledge that there are distinguished protection risks facing different genders of refugees and migrants, not only men and women, but also LGBTQI plus community. And even though in our current research, we did not really we did not capture a lot of the gender difference between different groups, but we rather focus on the distinguished protection risks facing refugees and migrants. But in our upcoming snapshots and upcoming research, we will integrate more the distinguished risk between men and women. So we, as already mentioned, we are having an upcoming snapshot next week on the protection risk facing Rohingya refugees en route to Malaysia, and you can see more gender aspects there. And later this year, we're also having a bigger piece of report on mixed migration in the context of Asia, and for sure we'll integrate gender lens into our research.
Thank you very much, Han. I believe with that all questions have been answered. Thanks again so much for posing so many questions, and thanks for the team for answering all of those. With that, I would like to close this webinar. Maybe a few quick closing remarks. As Han mentioned, there are some upcoming research pieces from our MMC Asia hub, so please do watch our website. But I would also like to mention, the link has been shared earlier in the chat box, is the For My Interactive initiative. Actually, a lot of the data that has been presented today from Malaysia and Indonesia, you can find it online. You can apply different age or gender filters or country by interview filters, so you can actually use this data and create your own graphs, just focusing on specific teams you are interested in. To stay up to date on new research coming out by the Mixed Migration Center in Asia or any of the other regions you might be interested in, you can sign up to our newsletters at the bottom of our website. And please, again, if you feel your questions have not been answered, or you have any additional questions based on the presentations today, do reach out to us, get in touch, and we'll try to answer. So first of all, thanks to all the people joining us today from all over the world, particularly from the region. And of course, a very, very big thanks to all the speakers, presenters, panelists today for your excellent contributions. So with that, I would like to close this webinar. Thanks for joining, and I wish you all a good day or good evening. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thanks a lot.